Welcome to Marx 5:13 on Marx and Engels, the German ideology, read in conversation with Monique Wittig's essay, The Category of Sex, with the brilliant critical theorist and transgender Marxist theorist, Jules Gleeson. It's a privilege to have you here with us, Jules, from Berlin. You are the co-editor with Elle O'Rourke of the recent volume that just came out, Transgender Marxism, with Pluto Press, in which there are many engagements, of course, with Marx, but also with Wittig in that work. Before introducing you properly, let me just set the stage for the seminar. So we come to the German ideology today, having discussed last session the Paris manuscripts of 1844, where Marx developed, perhaps in the most robust way, the notions of human self-alienation, particularly workers' alienation from their labor, from the work product. And what we did at the last session was to try to put Marx in conversation with Lacan and Lacanian theory on desire and desires to not satisfy desires. And we did that with Renata Selekel. And it was a rich conversation. I should also say that we come to the German ideology also having studied in the first inaugural session the theses on Feuerbach, which in a way bridge the Paris manuscripts from 1844 and the German ideology. And in that first session, of course, we spoke about the way in which Marx was setting forth an idea of new materialism, right, by contrast to the old materialism of Feuerbach. I mean, that's in the thesis on Feuerbach, which we studied with Etienne Badibar. And then also the way in which he's grounding all of his work in praxis in the thesis on Feuerbach. Those theses, those notes, published posthumously by Engels, are an essential predicate, of course, to the first part of the German ideology, which is all on Feuerbach. It's really an articulation of the theses, and there's been a lot of ink spilled on the relationship, on the differences, on the break, on the connections between what he wrote in note form in the theses and what he writes in the first part of the German ideology on Feuerbach. So today we discuss the German ideology, and of course there are different ways to approach it. There are many different kind of angles that we could take to get into the text. We could focus on the materialist conception of history that Marx develops there in one of the most first and robust ways in which he develops a materialist history, right? And the material conception of history. By contrast, for instance, and maybe we'll have a chance to talk about this with Jules, to a genealogy. And so, of course, there are all the writings on his material histories of ownership, of production, of modes of production, of state and society, development of consciousness, and how they relate to each other. And it's this series of interconnected histories that take us from primitive, patriarchal family structures through the ancient communal cities and states to the feudal system and ultimately to capitalism, which we're familiar with that. That would be one point of entry, and we could have a whole seminar on that. Or we could, of course, have a whole seminar on the way in which it leads ultimately to revolution and communism on his view, and the questions of the abolition of private property and capital, which in part we will be touching on. It's that material history that leads, culminates into the necessary outcome of the conflict between productive forces and social relations, which is also something we'll touch on. You could approach it uniquely from the perspective of a critique, a narrow critique of Bauer and Stirner and the young Hegelians, which is actually how I read the text, but a narrow critique focused really on those ideologues, in the same way in which Napoleon would criticize the ideologues, de Tracy, etc. Or you could cut in basically on the question of ideology, which this picks up on the question of ideology, and trying to figure out the different ways in which the text develops a theory of ideology, whether it's a one-sided theory of ideology that only applies to the dominant class, or whether it's a multifaceted idea of ideology that applies also to those who are resisting domination. Now, it was actually on that question of the relationship to ideology that Guillaume Rouleau, a student of mine at the EHESS, a doctoral student of mine who's writing a dissertation on these questions of ideology, suggested the pairing with Monique Wittig because of the way in which it is a conversation within a French tradition, a reception of Marx through Althusser and materialist feminists and Wittig, which he's writing his dissertation on. And he'll actually be giving a lecture about that specific question later on in the spring. But of course, there's another connection, an important connection between the German ideology and Monique Wittig on questions of abolition and the other dimensions that Jules Gleeson develops in her work on transgender Marxism, and also in the articles on the abolition of gender and the sexes that Jules Gleeson has written in The Blind Field. Of course, it's hard to separate all of these points of view because they are connected and they merge, but it's the latter link that we're going to be focusing on today. Focusing on the continuities and the threads that link Marx on the abolition of private property and capital, to Wittig on the abolition of the sexes, and to Jules Gleeson's work on transgender Marxism, on the abolition of the family, and possibly also on these questions of the abolition of gender. So it's particularly it's a real privilege to have you here to discuss this with us, Jules. Jules Gleeson first made her name as a Marxist feminist theorist and historian, focusing on the integration of social reproduction theory with trans questions and queer struggles. She became known for collaborative and co-written projects, including the ambitious family abolitionist text, Hinter Communismus, with Kate, and an overview of both the British National Health Service's failings of trans people and community efforts to replace it in a book called Gender Identity, Communism with J.N. Hood. As well as co-writing, Jules founded many book clubs, study groups, and circles for like-minded people, including the Leftovers Communist Discussion Group. And these networks prioritized rigorous discussion outside the purview of any one of the scholarly disciplines or academic institutions. The work culminated with Transgender Marxism, an anthology for Pluto Press that brought together some 18 theorists for a convention-challenging and era-defining array of essays intended to be polyphonic in scope. The collection has appeared on many syllabi, and the various frames provided by these essays serve as a point of departure for many researchers. Jules' contributions in the collection were the introduction, which was co-written with her co-editor, Elle O'Rourke, and How Do Gender Transitions Happen? And both of those developed Jules' particular interest in the history of endocrinology and the political work done by communities. And these communities have since been reapplied in History of Intersex Liberation, titled Hermaphrodite Logic, which I think you just got the manuscript in 2 days ago. It'll be out for Pride next year with Verso Books, and it focuses specifically on the movement, the intersex liberation movement's origin in the 1990s, as the closing moment of 20th century counterculture. Jules' current work is focused around understandings of sex as process and how the lasting objective rupture seen in the early 20th century find their origins in scientific breakthroughs across the earlier 20th century. So with that, let me turn it to you, Jules, and welcome to Marx 513.
I'm allergic to preambles, but there's two necessary points before I begin. First of all, it's an honor to be speaking here as part of 1313, and specifically, I'd like to thank both Ricardo for as soft a landing in New York City as I could possibly have hoped for. How loud are we? Is it working for everyone? Okay. If I'm audible, I'll continue. Okay, second necessary preamble point. Especially as someone traveling here from Germany, I just wanted to take an opportunity to express solidarity with Palestine. I am especially grateful to be here on Columbia campus. I'm sure I'm not alone in feeling truly lit up and illuminated by the occupation efforts we've seen here. And I think often saying the word Palestine, it sort of potentially sort of invites despair or moments of doubt and crisis. But this week with seeing the prisoners of Bashar al-Assad being liberated, often people with their whole youths or people raising toddlers as political prisoners, I think seeing those people liberated, then maybe we can have hope that those in Gaza too will be freed very soon. Okay. So I accepted this invitation to talk about the German ideology with a degree of trepidation. Stuff on maybe easier for people to follow that. Okay. So I accepted this invitation with a degree of trepidation, given the uniquely cluttered state of scholarship around the German ideology as a text. This is a common problem for anything written by Marx, never mind Marx and Engels. But the difficulty is simply that it's often difficult to reach through to Marx through Marxology. So first of all, I'm going to provide a brief recap of why the German ideology specifically has been read so varyingly, and the very basic questions of vying interpretation that exist there. And then I'm going to focus just on some of the most famous lines from the text, since we're limited for time. And then I'm going to see what we can sort of salvage and specifically segue through into talking about critique. So we're going to look at the German ideology in two versions, first of all. Okay, so version number one. The German ideology was published posthumously by the Soviet Union's Marx, Engels, Lenin Institute in the 1930s. You can see one of the first editions. I don't know if this is the very first, but it was originally published in Russian, of course, by the Marx, Engels, Lenin Institute. And accordingly, this original version sort of gives us a look not only at Karl Marx and Frederick Engels as they wrote, but also the Marx and Engels which the Soviets needed at that point in time. So this is, first of all, a very unified view. In the Soviet account of the German ideology, Marx and Engels used this unpublished manuscript, this voluminous collection of texts, to attempt an exposition of their overarching method entitled historical materialism. This is a term which doesn't appear in the manuscript, but which interwar Soviet scholars were very eager to sort of read into it a single methodological viewpoint. In this account, historical materialism was an account of class conflicts, whether within classes, was always making moves to present its unique class interests as rather the best for the interests of all. So they quickly would move to appeals to abstractions such as the nation, to the state, the economy, or to the market. And this use of abstractions would shroud the particular motivations and interests of the bourgeoisie. So in the Soviet context, this would often pass through to one of the cornerstone terms of socialist realism, which is bourgeois formalism. So bourgeois formalism being exactly this moment of class obscuration. While prone to this kind of ingenious mode of ideological self-obscuration, the German ideology was also the text which informed us that the bourgeoisie itself was never all that unified. This book introduced and made extensive use of this term, petit bourgeois, for the first time, emphasizing that, for instance, shopkeepers and other minor managers might remain relatively more primitive figures with backwards economic and social attitudes. And this is a point which Marx would then later on address at much greater length with regards to mercantile capital in volume 3 of Capital. So the Soviet account continues that Marx and Engels were thwarted in their efforts to sort of deliver this grandiose philosophical payload to the masses in the 19th century by Bismarck-era censorship of subversives, which was true across the German-speaking world. So because they couldn't find publication as they'd hoped to do to sort of set out their methodological exposition, it later fell to state socialist scholars who sort of had to unearth and present this text. So as you can imagine, this has been questioned in many ways for many decades, but a rather decisive moment in recent scholarship was actually as recently as 2017. And at this point, the very first release of the Marx Engels Gesamtausgabe, which we'll just refer to as Mega for the rest of this collection, as Marxologists usually do. The very first issue of Mega was presenting a version of the text which collated and sort of compiled as a single issue all of the different versions, redactions, and potential additions sort of side by side in a single continuous text, which you can get hold of for your own edification if you haven't already. And an accompanying article, which I think is equally important, and you can find on the official Mega website. So this is the official statement of the team publishing out of Amsterdam, presents not only a differing interpretation of the text, but also claims that it belongs to a different genre, and indeed even had a different target to the one we would probably assume. Rather than a systematic treatise or exposition of methodology, it was instead a polemical sequence of critical essays which were intended for publication in magazines that would host the typical inside baseball of radical philosophy, such as it existed in the 19th century, those being sort of Hegelian back and forths specifically. Rather than oriented towards Feuerbach, it was seemingly inordinately focused on a single post-Hegelian figure named Max Stirner, mockingly referred to throughout as Saint Max, given his his atheistic or anti-theistic opinions. They sort of elected him as a saint. These texts further are not solely authored by Marx and Engels. Sorry, I'll just get to the portrait that Engels took of Max Stirner addressing the free in the 19th century. As far as we know, this is the only visual depiction of Max Stirner that actually survives. And even this Engels sort of did from memory years after the two of them were friends. Okay. I think you would have liked it. So these texts were not solely authored by Marx and Engels, but also featured the former utopian socialist Joseph Wiedemeyer, who had sort of recruited into communism, and a figure who would later leave the communist fold to become a prominent left Zionist, Moses Hess. So there are actually 4 authors in terms of the handwriting you can identify, even if everything ended up processed and edited by Marx and Engels. So that sort of seems to make a mess of any account that wants to use these manuscripts to demonstrate a clean break from left Hegelianism. So rather than any comprehensive accounting of Karl and Fred's 4 commitments, the mega view of the German ideology instead suggests more of a review show. Just to linger for a moment on the question of Max Stirner and their response to his remarkable individualist text, The Unique and Its Own. Famously, Marx and Engels actually penned more pages providing critiques of Stirner than he ever saw print himself, in a sort of apparent overkill. But I think that it's important to understand the polemical form, which the mega editors sort of highlight as key to what's going on here. As they were written, the reason these texts were so animating and were such a preoccupation for the likes of Marx and Engels was that isolating an opposing viewpoint would provide means of both appreciating their honing and applying rhetorical techniques to dissemble their targets and to humiliate both them and their followers, as we can see in the continuous references to Stirner and Marx, but also with this work of kind of humiliation and degradation having been completed. And if you want an example of what I mean, basically the core of the St. Marx chapter in the originally published versions is simply Marx tearing into Stirner's reading of antique philosophy. So no pretense at sort of the imminent method that would later be associated with Marx, but rather a sort of overall attempt at transcending and ridiculing someone. So the point with all this kind of high ceremonial dissemination and humiliation completed, then the idea is that these targets would be used as sort of the cracks which let the light in. So this instrumental example would then sort of be followed through with by them by the aggressor of the polemic kind of giving themselves an opportunity to present their own vision in the ruins of that target. In this case in particular, it also needs to be added that the continuous references to St. Max and his founding of his own cult-like following, they can easily be read as heavy-handed. They were also a direct tit-for-tat response to Stirner's pointed anti-communist argument that Christianity and the supposedly godless creeds of subversives, his rival Hegelians, actually seem to share an underlying faith or even a fetish in society that Stirner was happiest to dismiss as a spook, so a source of inner torment. So insofar as a unified historical materialism really did emerge from these texts, the thing that they were attempting to do was sort of provide a response to this very early example of the notion that communism was its own kind of religion. So with that said, we're going to try and move on to the higher end, which Stirner and his followers, the kind of point that communists were making an example out of him for, and the account of communist relations that these polemics were hopefully intended to open. Yeah, and that's hopefully going to give us some idea of the clear stakes which we can keep in mind when interpreting this text, despite all of the difficulties which I sort of sketched out. So, I'm just going to read to you a passage, which I'm sure many of you will already be familiar with. And this is the point where Marx and Engels sort of introduce their own rather perverse account of what defines communist activity and how we would differentiate communist revolutionary moments from previous efforts. So this follows on from the prior point I was making earlier concerning the division of labor and how the division of labor and the sophistication or the degree of commitment to division of labor sort of being an index which you can sort of read primitive or more sophisticated economic relations, primitive or more progressive relations into. So for Marx and Engels, this sort of indexing of the two exists up to a point. But when communist relations sort of follow through, actually things seem to either reverse or collapse. So we reach a point where people actually become untethered from the tasks which they've been assigned. So here we go. For as soon as the distribution of labor comes into being, each man has his particular exclusive sphere of activity, which is forced upon him and from which he cannot escape. He is a hunter, a fisherman, a herdsman, or a critical critic, and he must remain so if he does not want to lose his means of livelihood. While in a communist society, where nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity, but each can become accomplished in any branch he wishes, society regulates the general population. And thus it makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow, to hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have in mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. So in the late George Commonell's final book, Marx's Politics of Alienation and Emancipation, he observes that at this point in the manuscript, this section about hunting, fishing, rearing cattle, or criticizing after dinner, the already rather complex manuscript becomes truly peppered with suggestions, it seems, by both Fred and Carl, with trades such as cobbler and seamstress introduced and then struck through as they sort of burdened all the different examples that they could think of, and then sliced back down. So this sort of shows us that the pair realized even then, adjusting texts that would not see publication until well into the next century, that they were illuminating or offering variations on something important, French days idiom that they had to banger on their hands. On the one hand, this emphasis on the trades and professions, the personae and forms of life that accompany the division of labor, followed on very closely from earlier Hegelian concerns. Hegel himself had argued that the advent of modernity was the defining crisis for all philosophical or political thought. As he famously put it, no man could be a hero to his valet. So he saw this as sort of the central concern and crisis, which at this point Marx and Engels are offering their own political strategic solution to. Yeah, we have to admit that Marx and Engels' argument, if it was a Hegelian one, had a perverse flavor. Communist politics could not simply be an intensification, more of the same antagonisms that had defined capitalist class society. And instead, communist revolution would stand or fall exactly on how it reversed the close tethering of one's station, one's potential to be a fisherman, a critic, a philosopher, a revolutionary, or whatever else, by how well it reversed that close tethering of one's station within the division of labor and the activities that one happened to engage in across a daily or even an hourly basis. So the sophistication of the division of labor could no longer serve as this kind of index, or it could serve it only until this revolutionary moment, until it couldn't. And at that point, a totally new set of priorities and means of mutual interplay emerged, what Marx, Engels, and other first internationalist communists would call the free association of producers. So I just want to linger here one moment, again, as I've said, with this is probably the most famous selection from the text. I want to linger here for a final moment before we turn to Monique Wittig. And precisely in this formulation, which you can see on the screen, is this point of without ever becoming, which I've also used for the title of this talk. So this counterpart to the capitalist fisherman or critic who must remain such, who must be sort of held in place, activity and station, professional persona, trade, call it what you will, sort of attending to them or impressed upon them. So I sort of want to flag that without ever becoming before we address Monique Wittig, exactly because it's easy to sort of read existentialism back into this kind of material. And my reading of Wittig is very much going to emphasize her commitment to the existentialist tradition or moment in post-European thinking. But also, let's not imagine that there weren't earlier attempts to grapple with these questions of becoming or not becoming, even if they use different idioms. While Marx and Engels are known to be averse to any kind of systematic approaches to ethics and morality. Here, at least, they place the question of becoming or Bildung essential to their account of scientific socialism and what defined it. Actually, does anyone have any questions? You just want to get straight into Monique Wittig? Understandable. Try to devoting myself. All right. So I really can't tell how much of this material is going to be fresh or already overly regular for you. But again, I'm just going to begin with Monique Wittig with a sort of intellectual backdrop. So the materialist feminists followed on from Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex, which, as you may recall, begins with Beauvoir firstly saying she's bored of the topic of feminism and womanhood, and then moving through into a systematic three-part reading where she sort of rather commandingly rakes through three different views of female origins: the biological, the historical materialist, and the Freudian. And Beauvoir sort of takes each of these three approaches for a ride, demonstrating her formidable familiarity with their existing scholarship, while the text structure sort of sets one after the next and tacitly shows up their inadequacy if any one of them is isolated. So in light of that legacy, materialist feminists such as Wittig preferred to distance themselves from what became known as French feminism, represented by thinkers such as Luce Irigaray and Julia Kristeva. And the materialist feminists argued that that school was overly restricted to psychoanalytic concepts. And they were skeptical towards notions, especially of feminine writing, in ways that would much later come to be grasped under the heading of anti-essentialist arguments against versions of feminism. So Monique Wittig's career in particular was spent offering sort of glosses of Beauvoir's core concepts and extensions of them which would seem to test their limits, and none more so than her relationist arguments that lesbians were far from being the most or the still apogee of the female. Instead, lesbians were not women. So we're going to run through these arguments as they were developed in this sort of three-part sequence of essays that in English translation appear as the opening chapters of her collection, The Straight Mind. I don't know if this was a purposeful mirroring of Beauvoir's three-point argument, but I don't know, maybe. So oh yeah, this is Monique Wittig, by the way, the founding red type. It's readable, but out of order. Yeah, so the first of these arguments in the category of sex sees Monique Wittig argue, but there is no sex, there is but the sex that is oppressed and sex that oppresses. It is oppression that creates sex and not the contrary. Wittig opposes those who say that the original cause of oppression is to be found in sex itself, in the natural division of sexes pre-existing or outside of society. So, so sex is sort of preeminent and the original point, and also sex does not exist in a division, but really like to be female is the only sex. That's the sort of generative. So in the next of these essays in the sequence, to refuse to be a woman, one is not born a woman, which is of course a quote from Beauvoir. Wittig tells us to refuse to be a woman, however, does not mean that one has to become a man. The refusal to become or to remain a heterosexual has always meant to refuse to become a man or woman consciously or not. Yeah, what I just said. Finally, and this is the sort of spicy line, which I'm going to try and line up with the German ideology. So I'm just going to linger on this one for a point. So in the third of the essays in the sequence, The Straight Mind, Wittig writes as follows. What is a woman? Frankly, it is a problem that the lesbians do not have or do not have to worry about, because a change of perspective, and it would be incorrect to say that lesbians make love, live with women, for woman has meaning only in a heterosexual system of thought and heterosexual economic relations. Lesbians are not women. So at this point in the collection, Lesbians Are Not Women is the closing line of that essay, and sort of the culmination, the payoff of a notion which he's kind of clearly been continuously developing across the course of these essays. So keeping in mind our earlier remarks about the German ideology, what seems key to understand here is the crux being set at lesbianism being not a variation of conventions of womanhood, so husband being replaced with a wife. It's not just a kind of variation which has been marginalized or outcast or denigrated even, but rather to reject having a husband, to reject having a father, is rejection of womanhood's existing terms to core altogether. So moving on from them and into something else entirely. I think that especially this quote, which I've highlighted, is especially striking given how frequently people are prone to suggesting that Monique Wittig should have been dated, left outside, or exists prior to some important queer moment, which we weren't facing down, when she pretty much quotes word for word one of the key talking points currently used by the far right in this country, and sort of tries to demonstrate how this doesn't really seem applicable to the sort of lives she has in mind. So sort of lined up not having to become between professions, trades, and now womanhood in a point that I'm sort of going to allow to suggestively dangle. But one thing I'd be interested to do when we talk about potential approaches to how to respond or how to situate Monique Wittig and this approach to negation, specifically lesbians are not women. Probably the least threatening or the most pacifying option you have available to you, which I think some of you are maybe already doing inwardly, and I can't convince you not to. The most pacifying potential view is that Monique's remarks on lesbians are simply one of internal conformity with French radical academic post-war thought. So we can play a little game if you like. So if Jacques Lacan tells us that there's no sexual relation, I don't know if you agree. If Jacques Derrida tells us there is no outside text, if Michel Foucault takes Nietzsche's God is dead and says that that ain't the half of it, if Baudrillard tells us that the Gulf War did not take place, and if Judith Butler tells us there is no doer behind the deed, then what does Monique Wittig tell us about lesbians? It just follows. So, what hope did lesbians have in that kind of a frame of thinking? So that's your potential approach, your sort of pacifying move if you wish to take it. But I think that a rather more interesting approach than that kind of contextual stringing along of things is instead to treat this as a sort of polemical approach, exactly in a tradition which follows on from the tradition set from the German ideology, which is to say, you play inside baseball and you play it very hard. Whatever follows to the letter and from the explicit demarcation that Wittig uses Whatever attempts, I'll try that again. Whatever Monique Wittig says explicitly to try and distance herself and her own position from Marxists, whoever she means by that. She follows on from Marx and Engels quite closely in that her approach to argumentation shared this polemical, exaggerated, and still very meaningful style. Now, I had various points at this stage that are trying a comparative approach to sort of Monique's minimalist, bombastic political theory trolling, and her love of producing these experimental philosophical novels, the first of which lasted for a single continuous sentence. This example, the lesbian body, was actually translated by an anatomist, because a male anatomist actually, because no one else is really up for this task of sort of truly visceral, purposely disgusting approach. But yeah, I think that the short story of what I'm trying to say here is that there's a kind of substance in Monique Wittig's fiction, which sort of demonstrates exactly what she was trying to highlight and draw us towards in her provocations that we find in her political theoretical writing. So exactly the minimalism and sort of breeziness of her political theoretical claims is sort of substantiated by the much denser, more grasping nature of her fictional prose. But I think, yeah, I think it suffices to say that I've lined up a kind of stylistic, polemical parallel, which I'm happy for us to discuss before we move on to actually getting into my work. So, shall we open up the first round of Q&A?
Yeah, let's do that. So, so the plan here is to discuss what Jules presented now, so that we can put in conversation Marx and Monique Wittig first, and then so to have a discussion of that, and then to have a second kind of presentation discussion where we will then go from Marx and Wittig to transgender Marxism, right? So I'll just maybe kick us off, and then if anybody wants to jump in, we can get the conversation going. So I'm trying to think about the differences between these ideas of becoming in Marx, Engels, or just Marx and Wittig. A notion of becoming that is very Nietzschean, right? Okay, all right. So because somehow it feels to me as if there's still some contradictions in terms of these categories, in the sense that in Marx and Engels, I take it, it's a contrast between action and essence. It's a contrast between the doing and being. And so what's happening is that in this ideal state, we continue to do the actions, the things, but we're not in any way glued to anyone or defined by them. In Wittig, it doesn't seem to me to be a relationship between doing and being in the same way. So for Wittig, it seems as if it is something about the imposition of a category. So the imposition of being, which in a way only applies to women. So sexual difference is the way we talk about it, but in fact, it's sexual domination. But I take it that it's not as if we continue to act the way we were acting in a way. It's something about attacking the category in one case, because it's a case of domination, of imposition on women, of domination, getting rid of that category, and then I don't know what happens to the action in a way. I suppose I'm not sure how action fits afterwards, I think that's what I'm having a hard time figuring out.
Yeah, for those not already familiar, Wittig talks in terms of sex. Women are marked out. She uses this term marked. So sex is marked onto women. And in my gender abolitionist piece, I compare this to how Mario Mieli talks about how heterosexual manhood, Mieli is a gay communist thinker from Italy, and he talks about heterosexual manhood for him is saying that men have to be mutilated into. So a heterosexual man is mutilated until he's a heterosexual, and a woman is marked until she's female. Those are these accounts. So for Wittig, at least, this just results in an account where abolition just looks like total refusal. And for her, she says, Wittig says if someone asks a lesbian, "Do you have a vagina?" she just say no. If the hospital wanted to register your baby as male or female, you should say no. You refuse everything. Like the marking has to end, and the marking can end. That's the abolitionist politics. That you refuse it every time, and that's the account.
Mm-hmm. But I take it that there is still a category of lesbian here that seems somewhat essentialist in a way, or that survives the critique of the category of women, right?
I don't think it's wrong to be an essentialist. What?
But I take it that that's in a way what Marx and Engels are trying to fight against, isn't it?
Open to the floor.
Yes, Hope. Turn on your mic.
Is it working? That's me. Is it good? I can hear you. I can hear you. Okay, so I feel I'm also trying to kind of make sense of the essence action stuff. I feel like this is more similar between Marx and Wittig than you suggest, Bernard, because on the side of Wittig, I don't know, the way you describe it, it's not going to be for Wittig that the reason one is a woman is in fact some natural thing that you have. It's going to be the actions, like saying that the baby is female, like, affirming that you have a vagina. So I think that we could take Wittig and see her as much more similar to the kind of Marxist idea that there's a question of how the actions you perform become a part of your essence. And then on the Marxist side, I think it's also a question of domination. Like the problem with the essentialization derives from the fact that what it is to be a baker, a hunter, whatever, is
defined by the system of domination that is capitalism. So it's not like being a baker is baking bread here. That's not the problem. Being a baker is performing a wage labor activity so that someone can, take surplus value from you and yada, yada. So it's essentially defined by participating in a system of domination. So I see these, I feel like I do see a way to bring these two very close to each other. And my question for you is, if we refuse what you said, okay, you can take the easy path and you can just say, this is all post-structuralism. It's all, yeah, of course, there's no real anywhere in here. And so we fall into a kind of pure ethics of refusal. And she does have in the essay things where they say stuff like, we can't imagine what it would be like to have relations to each other beyond gender. We just have to do that. We have to destroy the system before we can start talking about that. But as you just remarked, the concept of lesbian seems to belie that a little bit. It's a concept which is here and available for us now, but unless we define it as being a woman in the sense of a dominated blah, 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 doesn't have the same sort of force of pulling one back into the system of domination. And Wittig is going to need concepts like this because they're going to need concepts for how we get out of the system of domination. So my question for you is, and I take it Marx there's got to be some sense in which we participate in a socially recognized function when we go hunting, fishing, do criticism. So as Bernard originally said, what is at stake is the meaning of that universal or that role or something like that. So my question for you is, what is the difference between a role that is defined by domination, not in the sense, obviously, and a role that is part of the practice of overcoming domination? And so obviously there's a normative characterization there, but what I'm interested in isn't the normative status, one of them is contributing to domination, one of them's over. Yeah, it's the logic, the ontology of the role itself. So I'll give one suggestion and then I want to hear your thoughts. When we think about being a baker is the same. It's just a thing out there. My act of being a baker doesn't change what it is to be a baker in capitalist society. That's defined by demand and by whatever the bosses say you have to do, which is ultimately about socially necessary labor time. And the same thing is going to be true of what it is to be a woman in our society. My being a woman, if we think it means the system of domination stuff, does not change what a woman is. It affirms it at best. So the only thing I can get a hand on is maybe the roles that are anti-oppressive don't have that character. But they don't have the character of my participation in the role does nothing to the role itself other than affirm it, doesn't transform or change it. But I'd like to hear more than just that negative characterization. What do you think the kind of role a lesbian is, the kind of role a person who does hunt but is not a hunter is? How are those roles different from hunter, woman?
That's a really marvelous question. Since we haven't moved into talking to my own work, I'll just keep on talking about Monique Wittig, which I could do all night in case that wasn't obvious. The briefest answer I can give to you is, in the lesbian body, it's sort of largely a book about the erotics of cannibalism, really. There are also cats, because it's about lesbians. But the lesbian body is about devouring your loved one, and it doesn't provide a rosy, delightful, sanitized account of lesbian eroticism, and I think that's why it's so powerful. And similarly, Le Gourlet, where the protagonists of this novel are just the French collective, noun Elle, so they're the female collective, and there are a bunch of Amazonian soldiers who are destroying civilization, as one does. And there's a point where there's whole didactic sections, which I think are really great, where it talks about how they don't celebrate each other's vulvas in art or whatever else, or cosmically and stuff like that. But there's also a section where they kidnap a child because they really like the shape of his hips. It's a very, very large hipped child, and they get him to dance on the beach. And if you like, you can read this and say, oh, yes, the normative violence is going to survive through lesbian insurrection, and probably will. But you could also just see it as an anti-essentialist point about, that they're not attaching manhood to malehood any more than they want femalehood to be imposed onto them. You see what I mean? So yeah, there are a lot of these ambivalent kind of the substance of fatigue is quite problematic, to use today's idiom. Like it's quite willfully disgusting and repulsive in places. And I think that that's kind of the aesthetics and the kind of vibe we can still go for if you want. And that's the sort of positive content, which I think I get out of her fiction, especially. You maybe can't quite see, you can't quite see anything but the shadows in her political, theoretical work. Yeah.
Thanks so much for this really challenging and provocative link between the German ideology and fatigue. And it feels to me like we less should be thinking about how the hunter-farmer critic might relate to the unbecoming woman and ask instead of the German ideology, what would happen if the category of woman didn't hold? So if that, if the presumption of a division of labor and a mode of production stems from an original division between male and female, and that division is being disputed by fatigue, what happens to Marxism if we now take this disarticulated category of gender back into Marxism? That seems like one way to go. The second, with Barnard's question as to whether something survives the break with womanhood, the lesbian is not a woman, I think that fatigue's answer in a way would be no. There isn't a something that survives. In fact, the hope is that the whole heterosexual matrix will crumble at the point that the lesbian isn't fulfilling her function as the abject, undesirable part of womanhood that patriarchy can say no to in order to shore itself up, its virility up, and so on. Once the lesbian says, well, we're not vying for your attention. We're not women. We don't care. The category of woman itself is infected by that refusal. And so it's not, does lesbian survive the category of woman? The question is, can the category of woman survive its disarticulation through this kind of radical, what we might call, Jules, maybe a radical lesbianism that is different from what has been called a radical lesbianism, like a different kind of radical lesbianism. And then finally, with the text that Jules put up from the lesbian body, I mean, an interesting comparison could be to Hortense Spillers here, in the sense that fatigue is rethinking the grammar within which the category of lesbian has emerged, and is saying, but that grammar has simply articulated lesbianism as something that is part of the category, is the degraded part of the category woman. The not very good woman is the lesbian. So we have to destroy the whole grammar in order for lesbian to mean something else. And that's why you get this like litany. The body just is broken up into its parts and its fluids and its eviscerations and so on. So the grammar, what is the impact on Marxism, and the potential impact of all of this on the category of the heterosexual matrix.
I never thought of this that this body flesh split in Spillers that exactly has this payoff of the itemization of slave markets, right? That dispossession reaches this point. Dispossession passes down through the female lineage, reaches this point that you have no legal body. You just have this disaggregated form, this itemization of body parts. It hadn't occurred to me to think through fatigue and Spillers in that sense, stylistically. But now I can't unsee it, so I'll have to digest that one for a while. Thanks a lot.
But let's just pull on some of those threads a little bit more. So, reading Wittig's critique of Marx in the essay we read, The Category of Sex, I think is pretty convincing and pretty, I think it just makes us I think it just makes us rethink Marxism, right? So the various, I discussed some of this in the intro, but the various pieces that Wittig pulls on from Marx's the German ideology, where Marx is speaking about primitive or early forms of family existence, but nevertheless kind of re-essentializing gender divisions of labor and such. I think that's a devastating critique or something, or that really pushes us in a direction where we need to rethink. And I think for me, that's the trigger that then makes me think, well, okay, right, but we really need to rethink gender completely within the Marxian framework, right? And so that then raises one whole set of questions that are worth discussing about what it means exactly to get rid of gender divisions in relation to getting rid of class struggle or to overcoming class struggle. And what exactly is the relationship? So in other words, if you get rid of class, as Marx would like to, and as the Communist Project gets rid of class, I take it you can't end up then with gender divisions that have any form of domination, because that just substitutes for class, right? So the question then becomes, do you have to get rid of gender divisions in order to get rid of class? Or do you have to get rid of class to get rid of gender divisions? Or how exactly do those things mesh, right? What exactly is the really fine-grained relationship between class and gender? Which comes first, or are they so constitutive that there's not an answer to this?
I think I very briefly would like to do a bit of Marx apology. I don't know if you knew that's what you were hiring me to do, but my very brief bit of Marx apology is I'm happy to throw out the Marxist account of sex if argument by argument we can show that this corruption and contamination that Wittig believed herself to be flagging up is there. But the first stage is always to look at specific arguments made by Marx, or in dialogue between Marx and Engels, in the letters especially, where we read arguments like Marx and Engels are discussing the American slave estate and the peculiar institution of the US South. And Marx makes the point, for instance, that all of the ascent out of primitive patriarchy that America seems to have achieved is on the basis of chattel slavery. So all of this integration, division of labor, and so on, Marx tells Engels, is on the basis of all of this mercantile activity is sort of the predicate towards the higher tier, sophisticated economic division of labor. Now, if you believe this to be wrong, and you think that this is the wrong account of patriarchy, then we can dispense with it. But to me, that seems to be correct. The account of mercantile backwardness in Capital Volume 3 still seems to be correct. There are all sorts of specific arguments which seem to stand rather than fall. So I think we can't make an overarching account about everything that they say simply on the basis of much of it seeming sort of distasteful, outdated, or thoroughly problematized. We sort of have to go through thoroughly in the style that, say, Heather Brown or other Marxist feminist researchers have done, and sort of examine each of these arguments and the basis they were making at the time, and then whether actually we still think they're justifiable. Because often the answer is, yeah, actually they're right.
Yeah. Well, I don't think I was trying to throw out any kind of baby with any bathwater, whatever the baby is and the bathwater is. I mean, I don't think it was. I think what I was trying to suggest is I'm willing to stick with Marx. It's Marx 1313. From a materialist conception of history perspective, where does gender fit in that story we would rewrite in a way? Because I think it requires a little rewriting, say. I think I'm pretty convinced it requires a little rewriting on questions of sex and gender. I think you too.
Yeah, there was a occasion of me playing the hardliner.
That's fine. No. The question is really, how do you modify the materialist conception of history? Where is it exactly that we then insert sex struggle in that story? A story that ultimately still leads, I take it, to a communist revolution. I'm not altering it's not pushing in a different direction. I'm saying, if you take that story, but what materialist feminists show us is that we need to, how exactly does it fit, whatever. There might not be a clear, easy answer to that right now. I take it that's one of the important questions that these readings and our discussion take us to, right? I think. Right. I'll take any hands. Yeah, go ahead. Remind me.
Thanks. Jeremy. Yeah, hi, from the Graduate Center.
Yes.
Yeah. I definitely don't have an answer to your question. I think that's a lot of people are writing dissertations, I think, right now on that. It's a huge topic. The one thing that struck me in the Wittig was the sort of this idea of sex as something natural, instead of seeing it as kind of something done or a social relation. And its naturalness being sort of a key part of the ideological, its purported naturalness. I'm just not sure, so when we're thinking about things like gender and class, sometimes I think it might be nice to see how they're not analogous or see key differences. And I'm just not sure that it's the same with someone being a worker, that you see yourself as naturally a worker, and that you see yourself in the category of being or caste at all, because that is not bourgeois society. Bourgeois society is based on becoming. It is based on sort of becoming what you are, whether it's picking yourself up from your bootstraps or whatever it might be. It's a development, it's labor, it's change, it's transformation. So I don't know where that leaves us, but I just thought that was something that I found odd in her writing, the analogy between class and sex. That didn't carry for me, and I don't know what that tells us about political practice or our analysis of these things. I'm not sure. Do you have thoughts?
No, it's. I think that's a good point. That you're saying that there's an evolutionary. Yeah, there's that builds on your upbringing. There's that aspect that bourgeois ideology requires you to be going places, right? I think at once that's true, but also there is a kind of fixity which Marx is correctly identifying. Yeah, where it's like. You have to demonstrate that you have some. You don't want a surgeon who shows up as like, oh, actually, I don't know if I'm a heart surgeon, but I'll give it a try. There needs to be some sort of persona established and in place. And I often think about this in terms of academic writing, when people have all sorts of trite complaints about academic writing. And what I think most of the problem with it is that people are simultaneously trying to make a historical point and show that they're a good historian, or they're trying to write anthropologically astute things and show off their anthropological training and methodology. So there's a sort of double purpose that once you spot it is insufferable. And especially in terms of accessibility, it's one of the first things that they will say is, well, I am an anthropologist and here's my argument. And people will say, I don't know what an anthropologist is. So that is the kind of you can't get out of the gate problem with academic writing. So there's no sense of just picking up a text and being like, oh yeah, this is a convincing bit of writing, because you're sort of having to secure your training within the guild, right? So yeah, I think that's an example of what they're identifying in the German ideology, and I think it's still sort of afflicting us to this day.
Yeah, just to build on that, and so that's helpful to kind of like really force us to try and draw the parallel, I think, and to stay closely to the text. Because so I take it that, as we read, Wittig's argument is that the very category of gender is created, is a process of domination. Right. And I think that you're right, that that's not necessarily how Marx and Engels are approaching class here. Insofar as once the object is created, once the category of woman is created, I take it in Wittig, it's kind of like creating that fixity. But the processes of domination in capitalist society, I take it, would in fact create a category of class, possibly naturalize it, even though you're right that there is a whole discourse of, improvement, changing class, or rising up and becoming, moving from climbing the socioeconomic ladder. I take it though that there might be still the fixity of class, but what there certainly is are other naturalized objects that seem more naturalized in a way, like private property, right? And that's a little bit of a tie to the transgender Marxism introduction, because one of the most powerful things I saw in Jules and Elle's introduction was this idea of, whatever is natural can be unmade. And so perhaps what we need to think about is, instead of it being simply a question of mapping gender onto class, perhaps it's mapping the naturalness of sex categories to the naturalness of private property. And the way in which that is a kind of fixed essential category that's entirely naturalized and then does its work of domination that way. So that would be one idea. Although, I think it would really be good to try to get this parallel down as much as possible, because the category of sex is related to the category of class, it's related to the category of race, etc. It's related to other categories that one would also think of in this context.
Yeah. I actually would like to take both of these questions before we talk about the collection.
Okay, sure.
Yeah, I want to hear questions.
Yeah, it's coming. It's coming.
It does work?
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, I just wanted to talk about because I'm writing a paper for my Marx class on this recently, specifically about Irigaray and Fanon and how they sort of complicate Marx's idea of species being and of the worker and the locus of praxis. And I was trying to come to terms with how we can make an ontological distinction between the worker and the racialized or the femalized body, and what that means for Marx and Marxist thinking. And I feel like what they do by adding these different categories into Marxist thinking is by raising the question of recognition, and not just the idea of alienation being that it doesn't necessarily originate just in labor. So your alienation can come from social relations and from a lack of recognition and from a not being held as an ontological equal being, or being denied ontology completely. And I don't know if I was able to make a convincing argument in that paper. I don't know if you guys have thoughts on this specifically, but I think that it makes the question of praxis one that integrates recognition and the struggle for recognition, and not just that of like organizing on the level of the infrastructure, not just for organizing toward the transformation of the mode of production, but taking that superstructural, that symbolic order into as like one of the main focuses of praxis, if that makes sense.
Thanks for your question. Could you just spend one more moment though talking about Fanon and species being, because I'm very curious what your interpretation would be.
Yeah, I put sort of Fanon and Irigaray in dialogue to ask the question of praxis and what that looks like, and I was focusing mainly on black skin, white masks, because if you take Fanon's entire body of work, it's a big task, I think. But it's the idea that coming into species being and the ability to perform free and creative and intellectual labor and all of this sort of utopian thinking that comes with the communist project is to say that to claim oneself as an agent of their own action is sort of the prerequisite to species being and to free labor. And it's acknowledging precisely that free character of labor, which is saying we cannot enter into economic association, into free social relations, free economic relations, if we are not on an ontological level understood as equals. And that's what the gender does in a similar way, I feel.
Yeah. There's two ways I could answer this.
I'm happy to hear.
Firstly, I think for Marx, the freedom of labor, it's a double entendre. Like the proletarian labor is doubly free. They're formally free because they're selling their wage in these little packets, but they're also free as in free to sleep under a bridge. Like they have these two aspects, which is what Marx meant by it. I think with Fanon, I could talk about this for a while, but also I think partly the prominence Fanon has in the history of thought is based on the fact that the Algerians won the civil war and drove that colonial subjects exist in the past tense as an enraged diaspora in France. So I think Fanon's role in that victory needs to be fully understood, but that's maybe where I would begin. And Irigaray, of course, is the foil for Monique Wittig in more than anyone else. So I don't want to get into that too much. But I'm about to set up a lips reading group. So if anyone wants to join me in Berlin, we can go through Irigaray's lesbianism in detail, but I don't have anything to say about it right now. But yeah, thanks a lot for this question. And I don't think I quite have an answer for you right now.
Was there another question before we turn to? Yes. Okay. Here.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I want to sort of return to the question that was posed at the beginning about this distinction between action and essence. And I want to sort of relate it to what you were just saying, Professor Huckert, about the relationship between property and sex. And I'm thinking about this in relation to, I guess, like a kind of classical anthropological distinction that's drawn in a lot of different works between like the generic capacity to act, which is often ascribed to men, and the capacity to get people to act because you are treated in certain ways, which is often attributed to women. So this distinction is sort of played out, for example, in like the distinction between taboo, which is seen as like a property of men, right? Like their ability to create new relations, their property of efficacy, you could say, which is unmarked and generic and seen as sort of abstract. And then the capacity of, or the power of women, which is marked, right? It's inscribed. It usually takes the form of a kind of good or a value, right? Like a necklace or some other kind of like inscription, which tells you, this is such and such a person who I should treat in such and such a way because other people have treated them similarly in the past, right? So it's the value of past actions rather than the value of the generic capacity to transform, right? The generic capacity to act. And it seems to me that tension is in some way operative in, both the German ideology and in Wittig, in the sense that there's a kind of implicit tacit valorization of like the generic capacity to act, the generic capacity of the laborer, and a valorization of the refusal to be signified, right? To be pinned down by their past actions, right? Rather than being weighed down by the action of having fished, right? Retaining the capacity to fish and to do other things, right? So I just think that it would be interesting to think about those two things in relation, and also to think about property perhaps in like a more expansive way, as not just like, things, but also as like properties of people that are, that have a kind of ambivalent quality.
I hate to answer with an IOU note, but I'm going to answer with an IOU note. I'm currently pitching a book about femininity, which is exactly addressing this overbearing concern of activity. Yeah, like activity is the good thing of choice. And I think passivity has its own active sense. And being feminine is mostly about listening to people more closely than they're listening to themselves. And when you grasp that about being feminine, then that's like writing in a feminine way is very difficult, but listening in a feminine way is almost the only way to do it. So that's what I believe, but I can't prove it to you yet. I'm gonna have to write a book. So thank you for this question, and I'm on it. But watch this space. What do you think?
I thought that was fascinating. I love the idea of thinking about private property and then properties of people and in that way. So that was fascinating. And your response, Jules, made me curious about the abolitionist project in your work. And so maybe we can go there now. Which I read clearly in terms of abolition of family, which is, but less clearly in terms of abolition of gender. So why don't you take us there? And of course, to the work on transgender Marxism.
Yeah. I think we have another hour and a quarter again, officially. So We'll talk a bit more briefly and suggestively than last time, don't worry, and then we can discuss it. So I'd like to address the question of gender abolition, which you've raised just now, and also in this remarkable accompanying blog post to the series. I'm not sure if everyone's read it, but please do check it out. In which you sort of thread and tell us that you've become convinced by this sort of gender abolitionist strand which we read into the text. So first of all, I just want to make some general remarks about the collection. And the usual sort of modest primer that I give is that there are, of course, 18 different authors of this anthology. It's more of an attempt at a panoramic, sort of polyphonic view of things. We sort of got basically everyone we could fit into there who we thought could have a fully fledged essay that would stand on its own feet and sort of argue in its own terms. We sort of tried to include them. So that's the sort of modest disavowal, which I would normally try and get away with. But a more honest answer is that the collection very much belongs to me and to Elle. And I embarked on doing this with Elle simply because I knew that she had a command and a range across political economy and the history of thought, which very few people I'd ever met could claim to possess. And I knew that between us, we would have sort of like an editorial command or competency, which would cover a remarkable breadth of fields, disciplines, and concerns. So the collection is very much something that I and Elle put together. And what we were trying to do, to sort of return to this word polyphonic, is that we wanted each of these essays to capture and achieve what that specific author set out to do. And this then became a very personal relationship of one or the other of us, usually, not both at the same time. But one-on-one, the two of us would sort of be trying to coax out this essay that we knew each contributor would be able to produce. And I think we did a very good job of that. So academics seem to really love this collection because if you try and read all of it at once, it's truly cacophonous and overwhelming. And lots of people just look at the table of contents and then close the PDF and never come back to it. But when you try and read any particular essay, it's very obvious what the essay is trying to achieve. And I think actually the authors are very successful in achieving what they were setting out to do. But this is just sort of my statement of intent. That's sort of what we were going for and what I feel confident I can say we've achieved. An inevitable consequence when you're putting your work out into the world, though, is that people often have interpretations which surprise you. And the question of abolition has showed up previously in a conversation I had with Jordi Rosenberg, whose thinking I think is tremendous fun more than anything else, and also incredibly powerful combinations of both historical insight and autobiographical engagement. But anyway, Jordi read this collection and he believes that it's a family abolitionist text through and through. I've read Bernard's interpretation, which sort of frames it as gender abolitionist, at least in its like key, distinctive, operative, strategic strands. And someone I met called Lane, who invited me out to speak with Gratz, told me that she believed the collection is all about noise music, or at least there's this current of noise that sort of permeates and sort of like a pulmonary pulse going through the collection, which I had never thought of at all. But of course, when an orchestral composer is telling you this, it's something you should probably listen to or listen again to. So this is sort of the delight of putting your work out there. And in terms of accepting or rejecting an interpretation of the text as primarily gender abolitionist, I think this is maybe the sting in the tail when we talk about becoming. I think that what's troubling or what's difficult to discharge, shall we say, in terms of twinning trans Marxism and gender abolition is that any account of transition and what is happening when someone is transitioning is sort of like generally going to come down to this is a means of becoming through another means. So the less obvious way of going around forming yourself an adult persona in the long run. The alternative way of doing it. So this is generally what people come up with. And I think that isn't necessarily what specifically like a trans Marxist account would come up with, but what we talk about in the introduction and what I think is sort of the indispensable motivation, which has drawn so many people into the collection that 18 authors was not exhaustive, and we could easily have gone on until 25 or 30, other than Pluto telling us, no, definitely not. You can't have, even I think 2 of the essays we were going to go through with ended up getting axed quite close to the finishing line. So with infinite resources and no attention for the printed page, we could probably have gone on for 30 authors. Why are so many people being drawn into twinning transsexualism and historical materialism? Why is this happening? Well, I believe the reason for it is that people both want this sort of grandiose, broad sweep that seems provided by terms like mode of production and all that. People both want an overall panoramic view and picture of things, but they also are trying to address deeply intimate ethical struggles, which can only use, otherwise would seem to only be able to be addressed with sort of romantic, powerfully personal, humanistic, inspiring idioms. So people need to resolve this sort of romantic rupture that they're encountering, and also find an appeal in a certain sort of grandiose, cold, distancing sort of vocabulary. So I think that that's sort of the operative tension, which is actually what we'd call like an animating contradiction, and that's actually a duality or a fault line, if you will, which leads us right back into the First International. So Marx's critique of Feuerbach, where he actually stages it, is not that prior materialists had failed in their own terms, not that they hadn't provided convincing accounts of brains and mechanisms and things like that, but actually that they had disregarded sensuousness, so that they had sided solely with this supersensual dimension. And they were missing this kind of sensual, some would say even spiritual hubbub, instead of just trying to slice that off or put it to one side as extraneous to their concerns. But this was a tremendous mistake, and that it degraded their materialism specifically. So this is why in the introduction we talk about this Georges Bataille line of the contrast between the old mole burrowing away beneath the ground versus the soaring eagle, which other anti-imperialists are perfectly happy to satisfy themselves with. The transcendent drawing you upwards, the soaring surrealism, the upwards, the lift, the above, versus this kind of tendrils of soil and earth, and this kind of toiling creature that's some people would struggle to even imagine, but which actually is continuously burrowing away beneath us. So obviously Marxism sort of sides with the mole, but also still lets you fly now and again. So so that's sort of like that sort of merger of the sensual and the supersensual is what I think is sort of indispensable from my own approach, and also I think is like a point of departure. And I also think that's what that sort of is the basis for the kind of breadth and the liveliness of the tendency, which Elle and I were sort of trying to put onto the page and trying to get out there in a lasting and relatively accessible way.
So I think it would be helpful at this point, maybe if you related a little bit the earlier work on the family to these questions, because I have a hard time seeing how one wouldn't have how the abolition of the family would not itself entail the eventual abolition of gender, I think. So maybe you could say a word about that work on the abolition of family, and then and then we can try and figure out how far we're going.
Yeah, sure. So the purpose of Kinder Communismus, which came out back in 2015, so a long while before the anthology did, the purpose of Kinder Communismus was twofold. One, it was sort of to make what we took to be the more basic case for the need for sort of communist family family relations, replacing private households as like a predicate towards any communist revolution worthy of the name, which is of course not original to us. You can find that in the Communist Manifesto, but a sort of like restatement for the current era was like one aim of that. But the secondary hope was that we could demonstrate to people how the sort of more experimental piecemeal efforts that a wide range of people were trying to make in terms of developing new alternative forms of kinship. The key stake for us was not simply discouraging people from attempting to do that, but precisely making the argument that under the existing circumstances, any family that people tend to call the name will end up sort of standing or falling on the success which it enjoys in reproducing workforces, that is to say, reproducing the raw materials of capitalist relations. So any sort of lasting intergenerational family that people bother to call that will only succeed as such because it is successfully reproducing workers. And of course, reproducing workers means reproducing the terms and ideology that goes into capitalist life. So the point was simply to show that there's an inevitable payoff. Either queer families are going to be dysfunctional as families, or they're going to work as families, and that is obviously going to be to the detriment of anti-capitalist struggle. And our motivation for writing that is simply we'd seen people in any number of sort of alternative kinship or I don't know, VG is the term in Germany, housing, cooperative projects or whatever. We'd seen people basically being destroyed psychologically and spiritually by the process of attempting to do this, to our mind, impossible enterprise of relations that extend us into communist relations while reproducing capitalist workforces. So we wanted to kind of show that there was a payoff that you have to make, or at least a sacrificial aspect has to be made. Not to say Lee Althusser was right or anything, but he's kind of right. So that was sort of what we were trying to do with Kinder Communismus. And long story short, the queers got a lot out of it, and the left communists didn't really read it at all, which was maybe what we should have expected. But there we go.
Okay. I don't want to monopolize the conversation on this question. So anyone who, wants to push us in a different direction, feel free on questions of transgender Marxism. But in terms of the abolition of family, two things. First, I would take it that one would need to, in a contemporary capitalist context, think that the imperatives of reproduction of workers is declining somehow, right? With the fact that, actually we've got, there's declining need for work, for human work. And so, most of the, sociological and anthropological studies are showing that, 30% decline in need for workers, 40%, 50%, et cetera, plus with artificial intelligence replacing everything, whatnot. So I wonder whether we need to rethink some of these notions of how the system is necessarily tied to reproduction at this point. That would be one issue. And the second question would be the one I'm a little bit more interested in, which is something about something related to the notion of abolition of gender or abolition of families. I take it that in a way, the abolitionist move is not what the abolitionist move is suggesting is non-enforcement in a way. In many cases, it's not so much the imposition of a single model, but the resistance to forms of policing and enforcement. Certainly in the context of gender, but also I think in the context of the family. I'm not sure, unless what you're proposing in terms of the family communism are very structured, kibbutzim kind of communist child rearing. You could also have an abolitionist view, which would be that there's going to be no state enforcement and no social enforcement of what things would look like. So, radical openness to any forms, a declaration, whatever. You just sign a piece of paper or whatever. This is family, this is family. This is the way this family is working, this is the way this family is working, whatever. That's just the way it is, right? So the abolitionism there is not tied to imposing a particular model, but to actually getting rid of all social influence, recommendations, and policing especially, which to a certain extent, you could also think about that in the context of gender. Right? So it's different than the abolition of the penal institutions. It's different than abolition. It's different than prison industrial complex abolition because there's more of a recognition dimension to gender than there is to the prison industrial complex. It doesn't make sense for someone to say, you eliminate the punishment paradigm. Someone could still say, well, I'm a punisher, but okay, that's fine. You can say what you want. You can say you're a giraffe if you want to, but it wouldn't have any effect. Whereas, and so the question would be, how would that work in the family context? How would it work possibly for gender and the sexes? Does that make sense?
For those so minded, if any of you want a comprehensive walking through of different accounts of gender abolition, the book What Gender Should Be by Matt Cole, who's a friend of mine, attempts to refute gender abolitionism in every different version of its forms. I believe Matt has a chapter where they frame it as gender abolition 1, 2, and 3, and different accounts and versions of it. Sort of riffing off my writing, but also taking it into a much more thorough detail. So if any of you want to read an attempted refutation, itemization of different versions of gender abolition, I really recommend you check out this book. And it was at the symposium where they were launching this great work. And I realized that I have a very trollish approach with abolition where I very rarely develop it actively. There have been several books about family abolition out recently. None of them were written by me. And I struggle with abolition as something that I develop even with things I've produced writing about it, like family abolition. I just struggle. It struggles to be on my attention span until I read people arguing against abolition. And then I become the most frothing-mouthed utopian abolitionist you could ever hope to see. And I think especially with the social democratic, these anti-identity politics, right-wing, left-wingers, whatever you want to call them, the responses from certain morbid social democrats to family abolition, I found had me chanting sections of the Communist Manifesto online and other things that I would never do. And yeah, I think the arguments against abolition very rarely, they very rarely to me seem any more than fatuous. And even Matt Cole, who's a notable counterexample, I think can't compellingly do more than assert a sense of subjective attachment, sentimental attachment that they or other people they imagine might have. Sorry for trolling, but that's
so I'm your wrong interlocutor.
Huh?
So I'm your wrong interlocutor.
I don't think you're. I don't think you're. I don't
I
think
mean,
you're wrong.
I should have come from the other.
You said that you've been convinced by gender abolition, so actually,
Yeah. No, so you needed the counter.
I need someone who's more opposed. Is there anyone who really hates it in the room? Do you hate family abolition? Yeah. What's wrong with it?
Well, hold on. Okay, well, we'll get to you in a second. Fonda, you had your hand up. Can we pass the mic down and then we'll come back to you, Jeremy?
Hey, I'm going to try to ask a very narrow question because I also struggle with just like the sheer breadth of abolitionism and, you know, how it might tie to this. I'm not super well versed in Wittig's work, so maybe this is a little bit, you know, rudimentary, but I guess and how it ties to this argument of abolitionism. And my question is like, I think, Bernard, you were kind of talking about how abolitionism is in many ways this lack of enforcement or this lack of punishment, this lack of imposing, I think in Wittig's work, this category, the structure, this punishment upon people. And somehow that gets normalized, I think is sort of what happens. And I suppose like how would one, and this might tie hopefully to an earlier question that you asked, Bernard, about how the abolition of class and the abolition of gender, this very meta question about how they tie to each other, which is like, how does the question of precarity, I think, kind of come into this, as in like how much of this is imposed as like through norm building and through these sort of very social practices, but how much of it is just like people have to fit within certain frameworks to survive and, you know, to have food and I think about this a little bit in like, I suppose, just thinking about the demographics that are most affected by family policing and all of this, and just sort of thinking about, I suppose my question is like, are there, instead of coming to it as like, you know, how do we not impose or how do we get rid of these categories and so on and so forth, I suppose it's like, what do we have to create in a way that makes this kind of imposition impossible? Like, what are the types of precarity that we should look at that help, I guess, that make it possible for people to, you know, either be obligated to conform in a certain way or find certain things attractive, I suppose that makes sense. As in like, in an abolition democracy sense, I guess, like what is the building that needs to happen? What are the things that kind of make these impositions of norms possible? If in a world, I suppose in a world in which these forms of precarity don't exist, you wouldn't have such an easy way to impose these kinds of categories.
I think it makes a lot of sense because, I mean, in part part of your question is the relationship between the kind of Dorothy Roberts intervention in the family, which is an abolitionist on family regulation, family policing, family enforcement, which is tied to precarity in almost a more direct way, I think, but I don't know, Jules, then I don't know, then family abolition in your context. I mean, there's a difference. These are two different conceptions of abolition of the family or abolition of family policing, or right. One of them is Dorothy Roberts getting rid of the institutions of policing, social, taking children from homes, putting them into juvenile facilities, into foster homes, etc. Right? On the one hand. On the other, it's a broader discussion in your context, I think. Abolition of the family here is kind of the family structure, the family organization, etc. And precarity is important, very important for Dorothy Roberts' story. I take it, of course, class and class struggle is very important in your version, but they have a different texture, I take it, right?
Yeah, it's
It's a very good question. I will answer as best I can. I think class struggle comes quite late in the day. In my account, I am interested in why it might be that so many of the organizers unionizing Starbucks, for instance, transgender or non-binary. You could also look at retail workers across New York City, as Michelle O'Brien has in her research. There are many examples where we can look to where we see sort of mobilizing workplace organizing disproportionately being done by trans people. And I think if we then look beyond it into kind of leftist or revolutionary organizing more generally, we see even more demographic slant, towards trans people. But I think that's actually only part of the picture and only part of what interests me. And the reason I say that class struggle comes quite late in the day is a lot of what my work has been about, and a lot of what I see it as continuing to look into in different instances is actually the working of communities. So the working of communities, that being normative, development of vocabularies, provisions of services, what Hegel or Marx would call the civil society aspects, so specific dissemination and distribution within specific needs. This is the kind of stuff which community does endlessly and not along strictly demarcated class lines a lot of the time. So obviously this happens in terms of transition. So I'm trying to answer a question at this stage. This happens in terms of transition with provision of healthcare services, so directories for reliable medics, if there are already in the neighborhood, or provision of DIY hormones, often bypassing existing normative expectations for who should and shouldn't receive care, and sort of making existing sexological frameworks in many cases simply obsolete, because this is, especially in countries like Britain and other basket cases like that, this is how most people who are actually newly accessing hormones seem to be able to do it, having all others having been abandoned by the state. So this is the kind of work that community can do in trans healthcare. But I don't think that's actually unique to trans people at all. And I've looked at other examples with, say, PrEP provision in countries where the state is refusing to provide that. And in my forthcoming book, I look at this in terms of the development of intersex self-consciousness through people sharing experiences of harms done to them by medical professionals, but also beginning to outstrip and outmatch in their own terms those medical professionals in detailed technical medical understandings of intersex people's own bodies. So I think there's all kinds of work which we can look at, and it isn't really necessary for any sort of Marxist framework to exclusively use the approach of class. And often you can get a lot further by sort of looking at how community level work is sort of outpacing, outmatching, and producing technological breakthroughs which existing state or private healthcare channels would never be willing to provide.
Back to you, Jeremy, or anyone else. Anyone else? Is it working? Push it up.
Hello.
Yeah.
So what about, so with regards to the abolition of the family, maybe you can clarify your position, because sometimes I'm never clear. Is the idea that this is should be an active part of our political practice now, and this should be a goal that we're working towards now within capitalist social relations, part of the struggle to overcome capitalist social relations, essential to overcoming capitalist social relations, something we can only do after we've abolished capitalist social relations, given the nightmare of the bloody squats in Berlin. And, I'm thinking of Christopher Lasch, one of those terrible, probably right, left social democrats who hate, haven in a heartless world. And I just sometimes wonder if the critique of the family is similar to the critique of religion, in the sense that we're criticizing an opiate or a painkiller of the masses, something that provides people with meaning, especially working class people with meaning who might feel quite terrified at the idea that their last preserve of meaning is being taken to them by the evil left. So I don't know if that's a basket of possible worries, but maybe you could clarify the project via this basket of worries.
To make it very simple, with the first part of your question, I can't speak to anyone's terror that they may or may not feel, and whether I want them to feel more or less terrified. But I can say the first part of your question, my argument is that it's necessary that until the private household has been replaced by something, you wouldn't be able to get to the German ideology moment of detachment from trades and professions, and just being a fisherman for a couple of hours. I can't see how you would get from private households to that. So I do not have a clear blueprint or anything other than the vaguest sort of utopian glimmers beyond that. But yeah, I do see it as necessary and required. And I think I would struggle to be convinced of the way that when people examine and people talk about the way that their private households have treated them in the process of capitalist building, I think it's true irrespective of class background, really. I think the suffering and the expectations which people have faced down is clearly differentiated along different class aggregated lines. But I don't think anyone likes having mom and dad really on the big level. Specific people may tell you that they do, but I think a room full of people, I have my doubts. So that's sort of my answer. I see it as a question of necessity, and I'm not trying to purposely terrorize everybody. So.
Jack, can you pass the mic is right there? Yeah, please turn it on so people hear you.
I wonder if we can move on from abolition. Like, that was a really clear statement, Jules, that like the abolition of the family is much to be desired. Most people sort of agree that it doesn't work very well for the production of high functioning intimacy and so on. But not many people are arguing for the abolition of gender. And that does not really seem central to your argument. But what does seem central, and I wonder if we could bring this out more, there's an argument about the relationship of transgender people to capitalism in the intro, where transgender people are both excluded from all kinds of opportunities to participate in the market and incorporated into the market as a kind of shiny, charismatic object to be bought and sold. Then on the other hand, there are two responses you have that seem really worth our while to discuss. One is that if capitalism produces alienated being, where alienated being means that you produce yourself for the other, transgender becoming is a production of the self for the self. Something like that? Yeah, that seems really interesting to me. I would like to hear more about that process. I wonder if it can be linked to Fanon, disalienation. I'm not sure.
Always.
Yeah. And then the second thing that you say that seems pertinent to this question about the abolition of the family is that where a family is, rearing a trans child, one of the reasons that this provokes a certain kind of dismay or outrage in the family is precisely because the trans child is a message to the family that the family will not now go on to reproduce the same. Mm-hmm. And that is a kind of reproductive logic that is enfolded into the the being of transness that I would love us to talk about more. I mean, I think that's actually a quote. I think that's almost a quote from you, and I'll find it. Yes. Now many fear one generation will not follow so easily from the next. Okay, which that's just a great line that we could dwell with. There are also some Freudian things to say about that. But the trans child as disruptive of the continuation of the order of the same.
Thanks so much. What you said at the beginning of this question concerning the way that trans subjectivity has almost become this sort of capitalist delicacy, right? Alternative markets to be tapped, unfully intended. This is, this is in a way this chimes with Bernard's post where you talk about this sort of what you call our positive and negative, the positive and the negative aspects of representation, right? And I think that is clearly something we're trying to get across. Maybe not as clearly as we could have done, but I'm glad that people are seeing it in these different ways. The argument about replication, I suppose another way to approach this is just like, why do heterosexual families why do they have to look exactly the same? You know, you will have surgeries performed on a child to make the child resemble their parent. You know, why is this? What is this imperative? The child not only has to have the same values, they not only have to have the same genetic lineage in their coding, but they have to be the same, behave the same. Yeah, well, they have to be reshaped and stamped out. And why that is the sticking point is unclear to me, but it is. Like, it is the parents have to grieve and mourn. They have to let go of that vision of a clone. And it especially is bizarre to me, given this is what people associate with gay life, with clones and gay clones and all of this or whatever. But really, it's actually, that is true. But also, it has to go one generation to the next for the heterosexuals. So rather than romantic couples. So I don't know. This I think is really one of the cruxes which we've got, and I'm very grateful for you highlighting it and flagging it out, and especially reading my work to me. That's great. But where do we take it? I guess that's the next question. I don't know. I don't know where we take it, but to me that seems to be the problem. Do
you want to say more, Jen?
There's the question of, well, why do we take it? Why are we doing this? Why are we reproducing ourselves from one generation to the next? You know, it's a difficult question to answer simply through Marx, you know, and Fanon also wanted to know the answer to that question, but had to bring Marx and Freud together in some way, or you need some narrative about the psychic investment in the continuation of the same that is both narcissistic, but also, Freud says, creates social stability because we know predictably what will come next and so on. So the psychic.
Yeah, and the shattering that we can pass through as well. Like, I rarely meet trans people who are exposed to this passage of black skin, white masks, who don't have some kind of resonating, which we can't just lift it, we can't just poach it from Fanon. But this is, I think this is something any type of LGBT person finds themselves encountering sooner or later. They come against this accumulated weight of something against them that appears quite casually a lot of the time, quite mildly.
But you're also saying that the very emergence of a trans child in this unit that is so committed to reproducing itself signifies a potentiality of change. You know, it tells us that one generation will not follow so easily from the next. And this is linked to what you suggest is alienation. Alienation is being for the other. And the trans person says, I know you want me to be this way, but I'm not going to be. So there's a narrative in here about resistance, refusal, becoming, unbecoming, undoing.
Yeah, we get shattered on this deeply personal, deeply intimate level. And then we put ourselves back together, usually much more collaboratively than that, really, usually much more collectively. we reassemble ourselves, and then we usually sort of put the pieces back together and we turn out to be pretty efficient communists. So might as well make the most of it. But no, I think that obviously it comes, that's kind of what I mean. This community level organizing can then coalesce into the kind of person who does class struggle. Not always, but that just seems to be a slant, or that seems to be a, what was the word? Preponderance of it, yeah.
But not to throw a wrench into anything, I think we have to also remember how adept capitalism is at adjusting to changing circumstances and also to change, right? And so, for instance, how the Pride March became a kind of corporate march, right? So here too would have to ask the questions both of how is it that these disjunctures are going to get responded to and absorbed within capitalist logics and new spirits of capitalism, and then how to resist those new spirits of capitalism. So, I mean, I think so. It requires another level of reflexivity on top of everything that you were talking about, right? Hope.
I think I'm just actually echoing this question a little bit more of that like personal dimension. Like, this is something I really struggle with because it felt like reading the introduction to the book. It was really like transgender and Marxist. And for precisely these reasons, I had trouble seeing why, other than like a general commitment to human freedom that has nothing to do with my commitment to gender freedom or my own gender liberation, I would be driven in seeing the problems of disrupting the family and the problems of the kind of psychic process, of accepting otherness and so on and so forth, to feel that I had to challenge capitalism as a trans person. I mean, we know that gender oppression is very old. It's much older than capitalism. It seems like the best explanations we have of where that come from, certainly you need something about Marx to tell us how it changed over the past few hundred years, but other methods like genealogy or archaeology speak to the deep roots of sort of the cis heteronormative patriarchy in religious understandings, psychic understandings. And so but I feel torn because I also know, number one, all my friends who are trans are also communists, right? And I know if I had not read Capital when I was a like little cis boy or closeted, whatever, that I would not be trans now. Like the understanding of human possibility change. So I want to kind of just push on Bernard's point. I feel at a theoretical level, like I cannot square the circle. Capitalism will be able to eat transgender family nonconformity. It'll be perfectly fine with, trans community kinship structures, raising its little workers. And why, as a trans person, if again, I'm not concerned with human liberation as such, if I alienate myself from my status as a worker, my status as a consumer, if I just think of myself in terms of my gender freedom, why should I care that I can present however you want, wear the dress, have the mustache, have the pronouns, have the partners you want, have the children in the way you want, but I'm still going to get exploited at my job? Why should my transness care about, if capitalism would give me all that, like Bernard is saying, why should my transness care about capitalism? Why shouldn't I just be transgender and also a Marxist? Why should I be a transgender Marxist?
I'm still digesting the part where Capital cracked your egg, sorry. Let me think. Why do both? I think the reason which we haven't got into yet in this discussion, but which is very prominent in the introduction, is that fascists really want us to die and have turned that into a big vote winner, a big focal point of their whole worldview even. It's not just a matter of elections, it's something they think about all the time, very centrally. And I think that that's not only something we have to think about self-defensively, although of course you do, like it's a practical strategic concern. But also I feel like the far right generally picks up on things much quicker than the left sort of gets around to, because the left wants to attempt these comprehensive approaches. So this is even appearing in the term, cis, hetero, patriarchal, white supremacists. You need to include everything before you begin. And the right really doesn't operate this way. They know who belongs in a death camp by looking at them. And they couldn't even explain fully amongst themselves, never mind to a wider audience, how they look at people, who specifically they're looking at when they get these feelings. But they know, they have an intuitive gut sense, which they develop in all kinds of ways amongst themselves. And you can watch them do it. And I think what the far right often is more adaptive in this respect is that they're often sort of ahead of the curve in terms of what are going to be the full requirements of capitalism as a system and capital as a process of valuation. The full requirements, not just the ideal world sort of liberal version, but what might actually be necessary. And of course, liberals turn into far right fascists all the time, so it's not as if these are two totally separate, segregable groups. But basically, there are these sets of impulses which are very intuitive and are very pre-verbal, I would say, that are very powerful and not to be underestimated. So what we get into in the introduction is that there is a specific lineage following on from the new right, the Thatcher and Reagan revolution, as they called it, in the 1980s, which basically concentrated around the private household. In Britain, kind of posited as a replacement for society itself, although in America that never really quite took hold to the same degree. But the notion was all of this welfare state, post-war settlement was going to be stripped away and basically just replaced by little hordes of wealth and private rule. But what the upshot of this was is sort of a heterogeneousness and actually a diversity in terms of acceptable models of family unit. If you want an obvious example of this, look at the forthcoming vice president and see how many people challenge him for having an ethnically intermingled family. This is just not something you'll hear from the American far right. So there's a heterogeneousness which arbitrarily they can accept, or arbitrarily they vehemently and viciously oppose. And seemingly transsexuality has become the kind of one of the primary fault lines for that differentiation taking place. Of course, I can't prove this to you comprehensively because my account is very much about intuitiveness. But basically, what much of the left has done has powerfully underestimated the scope, dimension, and especially the popularity of these arguments that are being made. And especially they're responding way too slowly, given the traction and hold which these arguments are developing and the coalitions they are allowing to have assemble around them already being in place. So that's sort of like I feel like that's the indispensable sort of big picture political argument, which I think maybe you could get that somewhere else other than Marxism, but I don't really think there's a more streamlined way to get to that point other than what I was just articulating for you. So I think that's really the reason that even if you're not going to call yourself a Marxist, you should definitely take a larger sort of political economic framework, which is not simply going to leave you in a reactive pose where you're like, oh no, the fascists have shown up on my street in a large group wearing boots and so on. That is too late. They're already there. You've got to work out how to stop them before they form the death squad. That's it.
Yeah. I've spent like maybe a decade organizing as a trans person, and I've said for so long, I don't know what the connection is between capitalism and gender, but I know that my enemies see a connection between them. And it feels old to me at this point, because it feels like the power that gender nonconformity has doesn't derive from us being an interest group who organizes in the streets. Maybe it should. Maybe the world would be better if that was true. But the ascendancy of transgender that you describe at the beginning over how it has taken hold over the past 5 years, it's not because we formed really effective interest groups or organizations. It's, well, okay, at this, I'm taking a stand, right? Like, obviously, you could deny. But I'm much more attracted to something like Paul Preciacato's work, where it's about the way that the structure of capitalism itself enables the kinds of access to, the kinds of disarticulation of the body, the kinds of access to pharmaceuticals, the kinds of access to visions of new ways of understanding sexuality and gender. Porno power is how he describes that. And so it sort of, I worry that on an individual level, obviously I'm very worried about like Trump getting elected, and like I can very much see a possible future where I suffer very deeply for that as someone who refuses to conform and teaches in a public setting and yada, yada, yada. But when I think instead about like the survival of transness, I have trouble imagining transness surviving because we got good enough at organizing. I much more feel like it's the right is the powerless one in the face of history. If all they have is their reactionary resentment, what are they reacting against? They're not reacting against us and all of our power. They're reacting against the power of capitalism itself to disturb the structure of gender. And this is what makes me feel like these are separate structures. The structure of capitalism is not just independent from the kind of psychic dynamics of the family and things like that. It's actively undermining them. How do you get rid of transgender in a world with TikTok? How do you get rid of transgender in a world with DIY? The story of like the Nazis burning all the books, right? And putting everyone in camp and pushing us back, 20, 30 years. That seems like deeply impossible to me. So I'm asking for help here. This is like my deepest misery. You know what I mean? My like deepest like. So help me out of it. Tell me why this is not how I should feel. I should feel that we need to stand up and we need to be Marxist, and that will liberate us. That is the path towards transgender freedom.
I don't really know if I'm a Marxist. I'm sorry. I do have three points to respond to quickly though. Wait. So firstly, in terms of Paul Preciado, I wholly agree. I think I tried to insult him in this introduction by describing him as an endocrino romantic, which is a very foolish insult, really, and misunderstands the romantic movement very badly. So, yeah, I was accidentally complimenting him. In the fullness of time, I was singing his praises. No, I agree with that part of what you said. Absolutely. I think there's maybe even been a misunderstanding from the title of this collection. We decided that transsexual Marxism would be too edgy to get away with. And that was a rhetorical miscalculation. So I sort of wish that transgender wasn't in the title, and gender and transgender have not been my interest for a long while, exactly for the reasons you say, that I don't think that there's a political action group or whatever that has made a big decisive change, really.
But one of the essays is about transsexual rather than transsexual.
Yeah, I just wish we'd said transsexual all the way through. Really, my bad. Should have gone for all the edgy I could get, but now I'm writing a book called Hermaphrodite Logic, so I'm getting back to it. Yeah, concerning the right though. Oh yeah, here was the point. So the point you were saying, what are the far right responding to? Really? Well, the answer is they're responding to the same decay that potentially we could make a revolutionary answer to. Like, they understand the circumstances faster than we do. They can see the fault lines and the debris before we do. And that is sort of why it's just worth checking out. You don't want to be reading their blogs all day or anything like that and doing yourself psychic injury, but you should just have an intuitive sense of what they're focusing on. And of late, it's been us. So very flattering, I'm sure. And that's sort of like, that's my overall point. But I think what you're sort of saying strategically is what I'm sort of like trying to argue throughout this and my next book, that there is an underlying predicate of clandestine organizing that will be invisible until there are just more trans people, and there are fascists being like, how come there are all these gender ideology addled freaks out there these days? Like, they, as you say, are both ahead of the curve in terms of their detection of it, but also behind the curve because they will never fully grasp the kind of intimacies and Bildung and upbringings which people are giving to each other. And they would hate to understand it. And so they're simply never going to be able to fully grasp the mechanisms, the community, and the actual work and labor, which is making things possible. So yeah, that's like a roundabout way of saying that I think you mostly agree with one another. Yeah.
DIY are coming from global pharmaceutical production. And so, like, if what's giving us power, if you agree, what's giving us power is these sort of subterranean, like not being in the street, but building these. And if those themselves are directly empowered by capitalism, I lose traction on the connection with Marxism. Like, why is the trans person, shouldn't I be like, keep capitalism, great capitalism, yes, capitalism, no Marxism, that's going to get us a state, that's going to get us Soviet Union, that's going to get us no subterranean DIY hormone networks, no TikTok where we can see every other person's way of life. I love capitalism. I love that it gives us this anarchy, the porn, pharmaceuticals that destroy cis heteronormative, the sort of foreclosure of.
Wait, is that actually your position?
No, this is my greatest despair. That's what I said at the beginning. I said, help me out of this like terrible pit of despair where I find my Marxism, my commitment to human labor and liberation, pulling me away.
Like, you're worried you'll become a liberal?
No, I'm worried I will have a split subjectivity. I will never be able to actually connect gender liberation and class liberation. I am a class and a gendered subject, so I'm not worried about giving either of those up. But I don't want to be a split subject.
Well, you don't have to develop yourself as a proletarian subject. The point of Marxist strategy is that the proletariat is trying to abolish itself. It isn't about developing. We're not trying to build up the relation. We're trying to bring it to an end, is the short answer. But the personal answer is I'm just not the one to turn to if you're interested in neoliberalism's capture. What's the word? Complicity and co-option of things. You can turn to almost any other social theorist, and I'm sure they will have a long critique of neoliberal capture. To me, this is uninteresting because I feel like these theorists often have a very weak grasp of what transsexuality looks like. They definitely have a weak grasp of what intersex liberation looks like. They have a vague and rudimentary understanding, and that even goes for many of those who describe themselves as trans theorists. They simply do not have a detailed account, beginning as all Hegelians must, with the abstract and then moving through to the concrete in an accounting which actually sort of concretizes between those two things. That's not the game that they're in. So collaboration, capture, and all of that, it sort of just becomes lingo to try and insert a placeholder for a sort of process that they predetermine. So the more detailed and the more probing examinations of how people actually manage to make themselves transsexual against all of these circumstances, I think then the less space there is in the frame for this kind of like predictable neoliberal sort of accounting. So that's just like, that's just not something I'm interested in doing. So I think it's like, it's usually much more enlivening to work out how people around you have managed to survive and how they've sort of continued to get through stuff like despite the odds. So I think like once you have a fully articulated understanding of that, then we can sort of move through to the sort of risks of capitalist contamination. But personally, that's something I sort of leave to the last order of business. Like, whereas I think for a lot of people, it comes first in the order of analysis. So yeah, that's me.
All right. Well, that might be a good place to continue the conversation offline. across the street at the pub for drinks, non-alcoholic or drinks and food. And for us maybe to continue the conversation entre nous. So with that, I want to give a
Thank you
great
so much.
round of applause and thanks to Jules Gleeson. And to all of you for a remarkable conversation. Thank you so much. Thanks, John, for all the AV work, Ricardo for organizing everything, and thank you all for being here. So I look forward to seeing you in 2025. I think our first one is going to be on January 22nd, and we're going to be reading the Communist Manifesto along with the Feminism for the 99% Manifesto with three extraordinary critical thinkers. All right, so thank you very much. See you in January, and thank you, Jules.
Thank you.